Hi, and welcome to our video on biological carbon. It turns out that the molecules inside of our bodies, with the exception of water, which is what we're mostly made out of, are all based on carbon and contain carbon pretty centrally in their structures. This is intimately connected to our energy processes, and so that's what we're going to talk about in this video. We're going to look at how carbon-based molecules are produced in living systems, and then we're going to look at their use inside of living systems. Let's pause for a second and let's talk about why carbon is so important. Carbon, it turns out, does something really unique that a lot of other elements cannot do on the periodic table. It can make up to 4 bonds with other elements. And that's not a thing that most members of the periodic table can do. When we look at these molecules that we're going to be looking at, they can get quite large. They can be hundreds of billions of atoms in size, something like your DNA, for instance. And the only way that you can have that is because you have carbon at the center, with each carbon atom being able to make up to 4 different bonds with other things, which allows for this wide diversity of structures that we see. You need to understand at the beginning that it's all about photosynthesis in terms of where these molecules come from. So if we look at a typical plant diagram, and here we've blown up some plant cells, so we can see the chloroplasts where photosynthesis occurs. It's these green dots in this zoom in circle right here. Plants and other producers are really doing all of the work necessary to get carbon into biologically useful forms. The carbon that comes into plants enters in the form of CO2, carbon dioxide, from the atmosphere. That's going to be directly incorporated by cells that are engaged in photosynthesis during the process of photosynthesis. The other substances that plants and producers need in order to create all of the biological molecules that we see really come from the soil, or if it's an aquatic producer like an algae, from the water that's surrounding it. What are the things that producers need that they can absorb from their surrounding medium that they're growing in? They need things like water, H2O. They also get nutrients in the form of dissolved atoms, things like nitrogen and phosphorus and sulfur and a whole bunch of other things. Those are all going to enter in at the roots. By powering photosynthesis and combining it with these other elements that are entering into the producer, producers can make all of the different biological molecules that are then in turn eaten by consumers, which are then passed up the food chain and used by other organisms as well. Thinking about the 4 major types of biological macromolecules, we could talk a whole lot about each of these in turn. We'll go through them one at a time and just kind of go around. Carbohydrates, also known as sugars, are really important for energy. They have some roles to play in terms of support and storage as well, but they're big time, what we'd say, short-term energy molecules. And they contain the elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Lipids, if we go down a little bit to the bottom here, these are things like fats and oils and waxes. And lipids are really used in terms of long-term energy storage. And of course, things like phospholipids you will find in the membranes of cells, so they have some insulating roles to play as well. They're going to be made out of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and things like phospholipids will be made out of phosphorus, though that's the only time that we'll ever see something that isn't carbon, hydrogen, or oxygen in a lipid, is in a phospholipid. Lipids also play a role in terms of hormones. They make up the group of hormones known as steroids. And we'll acknowledge that for the purpose of this conversation, but we're not going to focus too much on it. Looking over on the right side of this diagram, we have our proteins and our nucleic acids. Proteins are responsible for carrying out all cellular work. We'll talk a lot more about how proteins are structured and how they do what it is that they do when we talk about genetics, because it turns out that the instructions necessary to build proteins are stored in a cell's DNA, but they carry out all cellular work. So they are incredibly diverse. There are millions of different proteins that we know of in the biological world, and they do everything that cells need in order to remain alive. So you need to carry out a reaction. You've got proteins that function as enzymes to do that. You need to copy your DNA. We've got proteins that do that. And does the cell need to move around? We've got proteins that do that. Each of these proteins does a different thing because they can have a very diverse structure. And we'll talk about why that is here briefly in a second. But in terms of the elements that we find in proteins, every protein is made out of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, and then there is quite a bit of sulfur in some proteins as well. And then, of course, we have our nucleic acids. Our nucleic acids are things like our DNA and our RNA. Those are actually the only two nucleic acids we need to concern ourselves with. And these are functioning as information molecules. They contain information, specifically the information necessary to build proteins and when to build those proteins. And they can help in expressing that information as well. If we look at nucleic acids, all nucleic acids contain carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen and phosphorus. So what's kind of cool about this, if you look at it, is that there's really only 5 elements that living things are made out of. And these elements are actually really common. Hydrogen is by far the most common element on the planet. Carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur and phosphorus are also very, very common. So there's really nothing special about the atoms that make up living things. What really makes living things special is the way that they're put together and the way that these atoms are put together in terms of their contributions to macromolecules. Biological molecules, by and large, exist as what are known as polymers. In other words, you can take small repeating subunits and connect them together in order to make larger structures as we build these macromolecules up. So if we want to think about the monomers of carbohydrates, we call them monosaccharides. And that would be something like a glucose molecule, that one single ring. And then we can take monosaccharides and we can combine them together into polysaccharides. So if we're thinking about this, monosaccharides like glucose can get put together into something like polysaccharide like cellulose, which is the main component of plant cell walls, or other structures as well. If we think about proteins, the monomers of proteins are called amino acids. And when we join amino acids together, we put them together and make structures called polypeptides. We'll talk more about that at a later point in time. That is the polymer that we use to describe a chain of amino acids put together in a protein. And then, of course, nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are the actual polymer, but they are made out of individual nucleotides. The only group of biological macromolecules that doesn't exist in a polymeric form are the lipids. They just exist as individual molecules. So we start to see that cells, even though they're made out of relatively common elements, can have a large diversity of the molecules that are present inside of them because of the ways in which these molecules are put together, and of course due to the fact that carbon is present in each of these molecules, allowing for so many different atoms to be connected together. As we wrap up this video, you want to check your learning and make sure that you can do the following. You want to make sure that you can explain how producers like plants can generate macromolecules that are used by every other organism in the biosphere, how they go from producers into those other organisms and move around. And then you also want to make sure that you can compare and contrast those 4 major types of biological macromolecules we just discussed: our carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. If you can do all that, you're doing great. If not, hey, that's okay too. Take a moment, pause the video, and write down any questions that you have so that you can get the help that you need. Thanks again for watching. I really appreciate it. Have a great day.